Our topic today is Syria's identity, and particularly how it has arguably altered as a result of the conflict in the country. To have a conversation about this topic, we have two scholars with us today who have both spent a lot of time thinking and writing about these issues. Professor Chris Phillips from Queen Margaret University in London is the author of two major works which have bearing on our topic. One is on everyday Arab identity, the other is on the Syrian uprising. So our topic really converges with these two issues, which he is arguably expert on. Joining him is Ola Rafai, who's a senior fellow at the center, and she's written a number of studies which again are relevant to our topic, for example, on identity clashes in the uprising between Sunnis and Alawis, and also on the emergence of arguably a Syrian identity. So we're grateful to them for taking the time to join us for this discussion, and I'll turn it over to Ola.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, Chris, for having the time to chat with us. So let's start with the first question. So the Syrian war, as we all know, has strongly shaken the identity balance. And we can see that it seems to reproduce the pre-2011 multi-layered identity that consisting of Arabism as umbrella identity under which Syrianism and Islamism follow, while the Syrian identity and the Islamic identity are fighting for empowerment. Where's the Arab identity in this fight, and how can we evaluate the implications that the Syrian war posed for the everyday quote-unquote Arab identity?
All right, great. I hope you guys can hear me all right, and my internet connection's a little bit wobbly, but I hope it's coming through. Yeah, I was actually just saying before we started recording, how, in many ways this is quite an interesting opportunity for me to revisit a topic that I've actually not really looked at in as much depth that I did up to a decade ago. So when I came up with the thesis or the concept of everyday Arab identity, it was very much based on research in the 2000s. It was very much based on the field work that I'd done, spending several years living in Syria, as well as Jordan. Of course, it was a comparison between Syria and Jordan. And it was looking at the way that in an everyday, almost unnoticed way, Arab identity is reproduced alongside other identities in countries like Syria and Jordan, so alongside religion and alongside nation-state identity. And of course, as you alluded to in the question, Oleg, the Syrian civil war has shaken that up, right? And actually, not all civil wars necessarily lean on identity politics, but this one did, and different sides in this conflict at different times emphasized particular identities. Not just, of course, the Assad regime and the rebels, but you think about Kurdish actors. The YPG absolutely emphasizing their Kurdishness. You think about the banner of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the fact it's very consciously got Arabic, Kurdish, and Assyrian language on it. It's saying, look, these are, we are Syrian, yes, but we also all have these component, identities within it. You think of groups like ISIS that obviously clearly went on a very strong, heavily Sunni Islamic identity. You think of all of the debates that the different rebel groups had over what they should call themselves, how they should identify themselves, whether or not they should have beards or not. These things that I don't want to trivialize because they're really quite important, but it was fundamentally about what role should identity play in the politics of our group, and how much should we place that identity at the center or at the background of who we are as an organization. Of course, that led a lot of the rebel groups to fall out with one another. Those that wanted to emphasize a more secular Syrian nationalism versus those that wanted to emphasize a more Islamic Syrian nationalism, or not Syrian nationalism at all, just Islamic identity, right? And then, of course, you have the regime, which, as you alluded to, played very much on its Syrian national identity. You think about the development of certain groups like the National Defense Forces. It was all about, all the symbolism with Syrian flags. You think about, of course, in contrast to the rebels, Syrian flag, it was all about national identity. And so it totally is legitimate. A long-winded way of saying what you said. Where's Arab identity in that? Arab identity clearly isn't present there. And I think it's a valid point. I think that at those moments, Arab identity was not important, and at this moment of survival, it clearly wasn't something that the contrasting players thought was the right route to try to mobilize people to fight for their cause. Like, it wasn't the call to arms that they found in other identities, whether it be Syrian national identity or Islamic identity or Kurdish identity or whatever it was. That said, I don't think it was completely absent from the conflict, and I think there are two ways in which I think it was very present in a perhaps subtle, more nuanced way. One, of course, was the outbreak of the uprising in the first place. What triggered it? It wasn't a spontaneous decision by teenagers in Deraa to start scrawling graffiti against the Assad You're Next slogan. These were protests that were inspired by what was taking place in other Arab countries. They were inspired by what was taking place in Libya, in Egypt, temporarily in Bahrain. Actually, also in Jordan at the time. People always forget Jordan actually had quite a big protest movement in kind of like February, March, April 2011. And the fact that inspired them in a way that, and I wrote about this at the time a long time ago, the way that the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009 did not inspire them, or the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2005 didn't inspire them. The fact they're inspired by fellow Arabs, shows there's a layer of Arab identity at play there. I think what's really interesting is Arab identity also plays itself out now, today, almost the other end of the conflict, when we look at how non-Syrian governments are justifying or seeking to re-engage the Assad regime. You think about like the discussions and debates that are taking place, particularly being led by the UAE at the moment, but also by Saudi Arabia, and this notion that Syria is an Arab country and they need to bring Syria back into the Arab fold, and perhaps if they can negotiate with Bashar al-Assad and talk to him, then they could perhaps expel the Iranian, i.e. non-Arab presence. They don't talk about the Russian presence there, by the way. It's also non-Arab, but like it doesn't fit with their narrative. But and if you look at some of the language that they use, and certainly some of the stuff that I've been looking at, there is some Arabness, very much in their everyday language present. Now, that's not to disagree with what you're saying and I did mention this, my research has moved on a little bit, so I haven't been looking anywhere near as much depth as you have, Ola, at kind of the day-to-day narratives of the regime. But I have read your work and it's fantastic, and other people's work on it. But it is clear that the role that Arab identity used to play in the regime's narrative is not as prominent as it once was. It's still present to a point. The Ba'ath Party is still, theoretically the, Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party and so on. It's still theoretically there, but it's not as prominent as it once was when I was doing my research in the mid-2000s. But I would caveat, it's not completely absent. There is clearly still, some echoes of that everyday Arabism there. It's just been, further relegated as a consequence of the conflict.
Yes, great. Speaking about Ba'ath regime now, so for many years, the ruling regime in Syria relied heavily on its involvement in محور المقاومة والممانعة, the axis of resistance. Yet, that's used to include Hamas and Hezbollah and the Assad regime. Yet, after the uprising, Hamas left this alliance, let's say. And now, this alliance consists only of Hezbollah and Syria, and thus it's viewed as a sectarian one, as a Shi'i bloc. On the other hand, there is a growing influence, as you said, for non-armed states in favor of the Syrian regime, like Russia and Iran, and also in favor of the opposition, like the USA, for the supporting Kurds, and Turkey. these actors have their troops now in what the regime used to call, continually the beating heart, القلب النابض, قلب العروبة النابض, the beating heart of Arab nationalism. So what effects would these geopolitical factors, would have for everyday Arab identity? Like, even in Libya, the regime, and this is very interestingly, like the regime sent a troop to support Haftar. And of course, Turkey sent Syrian troops, Syrian militias to support the other side. And remember, on the late 70s, there used to come to be a union between Libya and Syria and Egypt within, the high days of Arab nationalism. Yet after the Arab Spring and all the influence of these actors, now we have Syrians supporting different sides and also, of course, fighting against each other. So what do you think?
Well, I'm just going to quote Fred Halliday here. It's everything changes and nothing changes, right? In that, yes, that superficially it's completely different. It's completely different, right? So actually, the specifics of what's taking place inside Syria is actually unprecedented. And when we look about the power dynamics, certainly of those groups that you're talking about, we're not talking about a small number of troops. We're talking about the regime absolutely dependent on the presence of Russian Air Force, absolutely dependent on the presence of Iranian-sponsored militia groups, many of which are now Syrian groups, but they're sponsored and armed and trained by the IRGC, right? So they are by the Quds Force. So they're absolutely essential to the survival of the regime. Areas outside of regime control are considerable now. Previously it was why I say everything stays the same. Of course there was always the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights has been a territory of Syria that's been occupied by a foreign power since 1967. To that number you can now add large swathes of northern Syria. You look at the areas around Al-Bab, around Afrin, which have been captured by Turkey and its allies. Obviously Idlib is still controlled by rebel forces, but with a heavy Turkish presence. And then of course the whole of the east, even though the US presence is relatively thin, it's only about 2,000 troops on the ground. Their air force control the skies and protect the SDF forces that are ruling. So large chunks of Syria are out of regime control as a consequence of the presence of foreign troops, and of course large parts of regime Syria are controlled by have been infiltrated and involve large numbers of foreign troops. Now, why I say everything changes but nothing changes, of course, despite the language of the Ba'ath Party and Hafez al-Assad in the past of being sort of beating up about Arabism, being very nationalist, they had very large numbers of Soviet troops based inside Syria in the 1970s and 1980s. Like the Tartus base prior to the collapse of the Cold War was far larger than it eventually became. It sort of only was reduced to a very small number of Russians after the Cold War. But during the Cold War, when Sadat expelled the Soviet forces from Egypt, most of them that had been based in Port Suez and Alexandria relocated to Tartus. So having a sizable foreign presence of foreign troops inside Syria doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't have to be in contradistinction to claiming to be the beating heart of Arabism. And it's perfectly possible for a Ba'ath Party dictatorship, as they did in the 1980s, to claim, look, we are the beating heart of Arabism. We are the active, well, they weren't using the language of actors of resistance, but we are standing up to Israel, and our friends, the Soviet Union, are here to help us do it. So it is perfectly possible for the Assad regime to maintain that language, that myth, right? We are resisting the West, we are resisting Israel, and our friends, the Iranians and the Russians, are helping us do that, right? That is, perfectly. It is not implausible, given that this regime is very, creative with the truth. It's very plausible that they can, they could do something like that. Now, I haven't seen much. Again, I'm not covering it in much depth. I haven't seen much language along those lines at this point. because the language has mostly been about survival, and like you mentioned again, we discussed in the previous question, about nationalism and focusing internally and against the internal terror threat and everything like that. But what I'm saying is that it is not implausible that in the future, you could see a return to an emphasis on that axis of resistance, focusing on the resistance to the West and Israel, and justifying the presence of Iran and Iranian-aligned militia and Russia along those lines. So again, I'm absolutely not denying that it's been marginalized as a question now, but I don't think that leads to the impossibility of its revival. And I'd add that the axis of resistance idea was an Iranian idea originally, right? This was because remember, it came off the back of George W. Bush including Iran, not Syria, in the axis of evil, right? And Iran responded with, I don't know, we're the axis of resistance. And Bashar al-Assad leapt on this and said, yes, of course, we're the axis of resistance. That's what we're doing, right? And so they replicated it. But it is an Iranian idea. So given that there's a large Iranian presence inside Syria, it's not implausible that at some point Iran would want to sort of, revive this concept. And just a final point I would add, just a tiny point. Whilst initially, it's interesting, you noted in the question that, Hamas left, and they made this really big. Well, there was this, it was an awful moment actually, but it was a fascinating point from a political science perspective when, during I think it was 2013 or 2014, when around some of the sieges in Homs, and Hamas and Hezbollah had this great falling out over the tunnel technology, because the rebels in Syria had basically been tunneling in Aleppo and in Homs, using techniques that Hamas had taught them. And Hezbollah said, hang on a minute, Hezbollah, we taught you guys this. We taught you guys this tunneling technology. So Hezbollah passed on the knowledge to Hamas, who then passed it on to the rebels. And then Hezbollah were finding their designed tunnels in Homs and Aleppo, and they're very, very angry with Hamas for this. So there was this kind of big falling out. But that was back in 2013, 2014. Like, Hamas have really shifted their language now. They have reconciled with Iran. They're not kind of quite as close as they were, but they do have a presence in Damascus again now. They have not, they don't have the central command is not based in Damascus anymore, but they do still have a relationship with the regime. They re-establish ties. So again, it doesn't. The current alignment doesn't rule out the possibility of a return to that, even if we're not currently seeing.
Yes, well, I partly agree with you, but yes, about like Hamas and the alliance. But I think to emphasize the Arabism discourse and the Muqawama, the resistance discourse again, it might be challenging for the regime, because the Arab environment pre to the uprising is totally different now, with the series of normalization deals that Arab countries are dealing, like with Morocco, with and also with the Emirates. The first Arab state Bashar al-Assad visited was Dubai, and Dubai just signed a deals of trade and normalization with Israel. So how would the regime justify his relation with such countries that used to be, supporting resistance, but they are having kind of ties now, renewing ties with Israel? So it might be challenging, because don't you agree that the context is definitely?
I do, but I'm going to go back with everything changes, everything stays the same. Syria has had very close relations on and off with Jordan, even though they signed an agreement. They did a peace treaty with Israel in 1994, right? So that has never stood in the way of Jordanian-Syrian ties, because of for pragmatic reasons. I don't. Bashar hasn't been as tested. We haven't seen Bashar's diplomacy in the longue durée, because 10 years of his 20-year or 22-year rule has been a civil war. But certainly his father was incredibly fluid and flexible. He was very happy to take money, from the Gulf, from Saudi, when they're pursuing completely different, international and domestic policies. They're on different sides of the Cold War. At the time, the Saudis were harboring members of the Muslim Brotherhood who were waging war with, an internal civil war in Syria. But Hafez was still happy to take their money and let, So again, it doesn't make it, impossible that that Syria could have a closer relationship with the UAE while still maintaining its hostility to the West and to Israel. And I might add that actually there's an argument to be made that this would incentivize, the Abraham Accords would incentivize Syria to go back to that discourse, because they are the last, they're the last ones standing. They can say, look, these Moroccans, these Bahrainis, Sudanese, the Emiratis, maybe they wouldn't say the Emiratis because they'd need their money, but they have all betrayed the Palestinians, but we haven't. We're still the beating heart of Arabism. Again, they're not going to do that now. They're too weak. But I think one of the points I was trying to make in again, I'm remembering all this now, it's a long time ago now, but remembering, I go back to my hypothesis in everyday Arabism, is that the skill of the identity discourse that Hafez al-Assad developed, this multi-layered discourse, was that it allowed him to emphasize different things at different times when it politically suited him. So he didn't jettison the Arab nationalist discourse, even when he was negotiating with the Israelis in the 1990s, right? He might have played up the Arab, the Syrian nationalist side of things, but he didn't ever cut off the possibility of returning to that Arab nationalist discourse, And I suspect that Bashar al-Assad, who has effectively tried to replicate so many elements of his father's regime, will probably do the same. He won't. I can't see him turning around and actively saying, right, we're no longer doing this. We're no longer the Syrian Arab Republic. We're just the Syrian Republic. I can't see a situation where that happens, because keeping that in the locker for a day when it might be useful is handy, right? So why would he get rid of it altogether? He just might not emphasize it at this point.
Great. Okay, speaking about Syrian nationalism now. So amidst the daily reproduction of sectarian identities in Syria, there seems to be a growing sense of Syrian nationalism, even a pride of Syrian nationalism. The first slogan protester chanted in February in Al-Hariqa was الشعب السوري ما بينزل, Syrian people cannot be humiliated. In the same lie, the Syrian regime repeatedly stressed, as you mentioned, that الشعب السوري في وجه المؤامرة. Syrians are standing, against a global conspiracy. Also, Syrian territorial map, symbols like the map, revoking national history and promoting folk music, which rarely were used, as you know, before 2011, is seen now in quote-unquote everyday practice, everyday life in Syria. So is everyday Arab identity now unflagged, like a drawing on banal nationalism? How can we evaluate this shift from everyday Arab identity to kind of everyday Syrian identity?
So I would cover the two things. The short answer is I don't know, because because my research in the 2000s involved discourse analysis of Syrian media and Syrian government slogans. I haven't done that since then. So since my research has moved in a different direction. So I don't want to say you've done way more work on this, Ola, than I have. So you can offer your your interpretation, and please do. I'd really like to hear what you say. I think the one thing I would say though is that, just on the question, I would correct it a little bit. I never said, at least in my analysis of Syrian media and Syrian government propaganda, I never said there was never a everyday Syria identity. It was very much part of, it was everyday Arab identity was the catchy title, because I was actually trying to point out that at that point anyway, this thing, Arab identity, that most of the scholars had said was in the past, was actually still being flagged on a regular day in the 2000s, right? But it was very much alongside and often subordinate to a Syrian national and a religious identity within government discourse. So I would argue there has always been, and again, the point about that, promoting folk music and things like that.
Okay, I found this on the web for national anthem religious identity, so I would argue.
I said something around Siri that made Siri alive and say something. Wonderful faux pas. You only get this with live, live recordings. It's not for me to say, that I haven't done the data, and I don't look to do the data work on comparing and contrasting the balance between what kinds of Syrian national identity were flagged prior to 2011 and post 2011. I couldn't tell you that. All I can tell you is that there was certainly a fair amount of Syrian national symbols in the discourse prior to 2011, and I would argue actually, and again, you've done more work on this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it was something that Bashar actually tried to push himself. Like, actually one of the contrasts between Hafez and Bashar was, even things like the symbols of the national flag. Like, you look, most of the propaganda and government symbols up to 2000, you'd see the Ba'ath Party flag, which is the Palestinian flag, as prominent as the Syrian national flag, right, the two-star flag. From around 2002, 2003, as Bashar begins to get more established, that Ba'ath Party flag tends to disappear, apart from in Ba'ath Party locations, so like in the party headquarters and things like that. And you think about things like the 2007 re-election campaign, where the slogan was "Naam," yes, or Minhebek, we love you. That was basically it. That was the slogan, right? But all the symbols there were just Bashar's face with a map of Syria and a flag behind it, like that. There was no everyday Arabism there. So already that was something that was part of his discourse. So it wasn't like he kind of pulled this Syrian nationalism out of nothing in 2011 when he was looking for something to rally people around. It was already there. He was already promoting it, producing it more so than Arab identity in the 2000s.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. There even, when Bashar al-Assad came to power, by the Hamidiyya, by all Damascus, there was a huge poster. I believe in Syria for Assad. This was kind of the first sign of Syrian. I believe in Syria with the Syrian flag. And now, interestingly, it was removed for al-Bouti, for the who was assassinated, and now kind of shifting for kind of Islamic Syrian slogan. Very interesting. So,
and is that then in Hamidiyya? Is it now Bouti?
Not yet, but for 2 years it was Bouti instead of Bashar al-Assad with "I believe in Syria." Remember, "I believe in Syria." It was a huge poster for him with the Syrian flag. 2008. Yes.
But it's interesting. But isn't that interesting that and that shows again about the value and the fluidity of utilizing identity. So at that point, right after Bouti was assassinated, there's clearly fear from the regime that the worst thing that could happen would be for the conservative Sunni merchant class, but those middle classes living in central Damascus, that see that poster every day in the central Suq Hamidiyya. The worst thing that could happen would be for them to join the rebels. And at that point, the rebels were not as radicalized, but they were emphasizing their Sunni identity. They were, one of their slogans, was "We want a leader who fears God." This notion that as an Alawi, you've written about this because I've read it in your thesis. As an Alawi, Assad can't fear God because he's not a true Muslim, and so on. So the fact they're sort of emphasizing Bouti as this kind of Sunni religious establishment figure and saying, look, he's with the regime. Well, he's died, but he's now he was with the regime. It's a way of pulling on that religious identity, that Islamic identity, as a tool to try to maintain support. So it's it shows the value that, at least, and again, it might not work, but it shows how the regime thinks.
Like, and the social structure, if you allow me, the social structure, because the old Suq al-Hamidiyya is kind of run by the Damascene elite, So we can see the manipulation of religious identity, social identity, and also we can draw on symbolism as well as material structure. So I do agree with you, and it is fascinating.
But
speaking about,
I was just going to say, though, what's really great about it is it shows actually in action the logic of using those identities. So they're like, okay, right, we've got a picture of Assad and national symbols. But at this moment in time, we think we're going to take that down, and it makes more sense to put a picture of Bouti up, right? Why are they thinking that? Because at that point, you know, they're thinking, okay, maybe Assad and Syrian national identity isn't the asset that we need to try to keep these people on side. Booty is. And then at some point, they change their mind and take that down and put up another picture of Assad, right? So, like, you know, you see that, you know, the thinking is there. It might not work, but that's clearly what the thinking is.
And they see this picture every day. But if you go further to Suq al-Hamidiyya, to Harit al-Amin, or the Shia district by Maqam Sayyida Ruqiyya, you will see a lot of posters for Shuhada Shia, for Iraqis, for Iranian. So this clash of identities is visual. You see it whenever you're walking around the old city of Damascus, which is also, that's why I agree and kind of disagree with you. Because yes, regime is manipulating this. We have al-Houthi now, we have the religious identity, the Sunni identity, we're with you. You go further to Maqam Sayyida Ruqiyya and to other, you know it well, I guess, and you will see more and more posters, which is very...
But what's interesting about all that is that there's a clear hierarchy there. It's a very deliberate hierarchy. It's like, you know, you do not see, and I, you know, again, I've not been back to Suq Hamidiyya since the war began. I loved your research. It was actually taking us back through it, right? You know, so it's really useful. But I'm thinking, you know, I know the places you're talking about, and it is that thing, isn't it? It's, you know, clearly, like you brilliantly documented, there's been an increase in, you know, in not only the number of, you know, foreign Shia or even domestic Shia inside what historically had not significantly, obviously you did have a Shia presence there, right? Because there was the mosque there and everything. But you know, the willingness to show the symbols, that was a change, that was a shift. But still, even then, it's not like they plastered a massive poster of Ali, you know, on the top of Suq Hamidiyya, right? You know, there are boundaries, there are rules, there are limitations. There are messages that the powers that be are still trying to get out there, and it's. I understand that it's actually been very carefully considered. Actually, you know, it's that you know testing boundaries, and what my understanding as well, and I think it was you that wrote about this, but you know, 2017, 2018, there was a backlash against the Shia presence in the old city. And they actually shut down a lot of those symbols, so a lot of those posters were taken down. And like, you know, the presence was, you know, they got a lot of the Shia fighters off the checkpoints and replaced them with members of the National Defense Forces and things like that, because actually, you know, when the situation was slightly less acute and slightly less dangerous, you know, people were pushing back. People at a local level were complaining and saying, like, we don't want these Shias here. And so actually those symbols were contracted and pushed back, you know. And I suspect, I've no idea because I wasn't there, but I bet at that moment you suddenly got loads more posters with the national flag up there, you know, really being like, oh no, we're all Syrians, we're all Syrian, you know. So it's, you know, it's that use of identity, isn't it?
Yes, yes, you're right. And speaking about in the same light about media, so the power of state-run media seems to be very limited in the age of digital media. Audiences are subjected to various sources with multiple quote-unquote everyday content on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, you name it. And so to what extent would this challenge banal nationalism? How can we rethink banal nationalism in the age of digital media, where you have, you know, various, as we said, on Instagram, they go live on YouTube, like even in a very remote area in Idlib. I don't know how they can have access to internet there. You would see teenager, 14, 15 years old, has his own, you know, channel going live on YouTube or TikTok, and he has, you know, a fair amount of followers, more than thousands, you know. So this is a big challenge. How can we rethink this banal nationalism written? There was no Facebook, no Twitter, no digital media, even barely cell phones, I guess. So what do you think?
It's a great question. I don't have an answer to it because again, you like my research has moved in different directions, and as you said, banal nationalism, which Michael Billig wrote in the 1990s, was very much about the print media, and people like myself, people like Mark Lynch, made this real effort to translate it to the new media of the age, which then was satellite television. And so the work I was doing. You know, Mark did much better work than me on Al Jazeera and things like that, you know, in the early 2000s, and I just took it to the national media level and looked at what was going on in places like Syria and and Jordan, and again scholars who are far more talented than me, like Krista Salamandra and people like that, done really great stuff. Looking in a lot of depth at what then was this treasure trove of pan-Arab, satellite television. Also at a time where we have to hold our hands up as well. In terms of the nature and identity of the scholars that were writing then. This was a time when actually there weren't that many Syrians writing in English. And so people like me were saying, oh, look at this, no one's writing about this, but now loads of, again, far more talented than me Syrian scholars are writing this stuff in English, and it's brilliant. People such as yourselves that have written really fascinating in-depth explorations of new media, and and the highlight to me how, I suppose, outdated the research I was doing in the 2000s and before that in the 1990s was, because we were very much looking at media as it was then as this top-down phenomena, right? It was something that was decided upon, the content was decided upon by governments or producers, and the Al Jazeera effect is what everyone was looking at the time. People like Marwan Crady and others like that were doing some really great stuff, but they're talking about how does this relate to what the Qatari government want? And I was looking at, how does what Syrian national television is related to what the Syrian national government wants to say and what the Jordanian national government wants to say. The whole point about social media and new media is that it's bottom up. It is a platform is given to it by bigger transnational companies, and sometimes by government-owned platforms like TikTok and others like that. But the nature of the content is it's not driven by a particular agenda, it's driven from the bottom. And so what you would probably, what I suppose an adaptation of banal nationalism would be to look, okay, well, actually, what are the common threads? What actually, if you get a bunch of, Syrian TikTokers or Instagrammers, from Idlib or from Damascus or from wherever, okay, what have they got in common? What are they all choosing to do? What discourses are they using? What languages are they using? And actually, what are the differences? Can you actually thread something that they are all producing, perhaps subconsciously, that has been in that, been reproduced at a top-down level from another time? And are they subconsciously actually feeding into a narrative, or alternatively, are they actually transgressing the narrative and changing, challenging what they've been taught by governments, and why this will be really interesting is, of course, alluding to the point I mentioned to you before, that what Syrian, and again, it's not for me to say as a non-Syrian, but what Syrian media now is going to be hugely debated, because of course you've got Syrians all over the world in a way that, you've always had Syrians all over the world, you've had, but several generations, but you've had a generation of recent, recent migrants away from Syria, a Syrian that has lived in Germany for 8 years, how, what their media is that Syrian media, is, a Syrian Kurd who doesn't want to be part of Syria anymore, but is living in, in Hasakeh, but wants, the northeastern region to be independent. Is that Syrian media? Is, so, someone living in Tartus, producing something, is that Syrian media? Arguably it all is, but to try to thread some kind of banal nationalist commonality amongst those would, again, I don't know if you could do it, but it would be fascinating to see. Certainly is way beyond my skill level, and would be, I'd be fascinated. Please, Ola, do that. That would be great. But but that would be the challenge, right?
Yes, absolutely. So in your book, Everyday Arab Identity, some more than 10 years ago, you provided fascinating and valuable account on how Arab identity being reproduced every day in Syria and Jordan. Yet the argument, as you said yourself, it's not very applicable to Syria, to today's Syria, to the pre-2000 Syria. Would it be the same for Jordan if an uprising erupted and civil unrest occurred, given that there is not much identity there? You have the Jordanian, Palestinian, Jordanian, so the clashes might be, limited. What do you think?
I'm sorry to say, give the same answer. I don't know. Which is, bear in mind that, again, I've moved into different research areas, and my research in Jordan was done between 2008 and 2010, which is a very long time ago now. And things have changed in Jordan. I've followed it at a high political level, but I've not been doing that kind of discourse analysis, so I couldn't tell you whether or not it would actually be a fascinating comparison, wouldn't it? Because you could look at Jordan has not experienced civil war. It's experienced a protest movement. It's experienced internal elite level machinations we've recently seen with Prince Hamza and everything. But it hasn't undergone a civil war, and it certainly hasn't undergone the kind of fracturing that Syria has, right? So it would actually be quite interesting to compare the two and say, well, yes, all these trends that you're talking about, or like in Syria, that we're assuming are a consequence of the war. What's happened in Jordan? Is Jordan actually following the same path it did 2008 to 10? And actually, you've got a very similar identity discourse that's being reproduced, by the government, that is then perhaps been added to by new media, by social media or something? Or has it, has the government had to adapt to this new media form, and of course the geopolitical changes around it? Or is it actually really different? Is it itself completely different to where it was in 2008 to 10? And even though they haven't had a civil war, it has gone through a transformation, whereby Jordanians are conceptualizing themselves differently, seeing their role in the Arab world differently. Are they, do they even conceptualize themselves as Arab? One thing that I find really interesting, just kind of taking a step back away from the Syria-Jordan thing to the broader Arab point. I'm very fortunate at Queen Mary University. We have a very multicultural student body. We have a lot of students from the Middle East who come and study each year, and normally in my class I have multiple students in each class from different countries in the Arab world. And whenever we talk about, and I don't try to get to read my stuff especially, but we do talk about Arab nationalism and Nasser and all this kind of thing. And one of the big questions I always ask them is, like, are you an Arab? Do you define yourself as an Arab? And almost always, wherever they're from, they would say yes. And so I say, well, and what does that mean? And that's when the answer is always really different, often depending on the country they're from. And you will get different discourses that come up. And I'm not saying that means that they are, they've consumed their government propaganda or anything like that. It might be the other way around. It might be something that is passed down at a more organic level, family to family, of a concept of what being an Arab means. And for some, but in many ways, it replicates the debates and discourses that I investigated back in in the late 2000s. Some people see it as a religious thing. They very much relate it to Sunni Islam, like being an Arab is about being a Muslim. Others see it in a far more linguistic notion. Oh, it means you're an Arabic speaker. Others really do still lean back on the kind of Nasserist idea and say, well, actually the Arabs are a nation that were artificially divided by colonial authorities, and it's not going to happen, but we are effectively the same people, even if we have sort of regional and cultural differences. So it's still something that's kind of there, but just and it's still highly debated. And the classic one that I always throw up at my students is football, which is, okay, right, so if your country's not in the World Cup, which country will you follow? And normally they will say, oh, well, the Arab one. Unless it's insert country we don't like here. So, the Algerians will say, oh, yeah, I'll take the Arab one, except for Egypt. The Egyptians, the Algerians really don't like one another in terms of football rivalry and so on. But, you get that. But interestingly, you then get some saying, like, if there's not an Arab country, they'll say, oh, I'll follow Turkey because it's a Muslim country. So that, there's an element of that there as well. And it is just quite interesting how those identities manifest themselves. Now, I'm not saying that is the case. That is a anecdotal, report from my classes. It obviously is a very particular segment of society, those wealthy enough to study abroad at a university in London. I got far more diverse range of debates when I did my field research in Syria and Jordan all those years ago.
Yeah, very interesting. And I agree with you about the football. Like 4 years ago, though, when Tunisia qualified for the World Cup, So Syrians were divided whether to support Tunisia or not, because Tunisia has double standard as regards the Syrian uprising. So it was interesting, and I agree with you. Always football, you know, like you see high nationalism when it comes to football.
But what's so great, just to say that the very fact that that debate existed shows the continued relevance of Arab identity. They wouldn't be saying that about, oh, should we support France or not? It depends on their stance on the Syrian uprising. The very fact that Tunisia, as an Arab country, is identified as someone that we should, you know, probably should support, but I'm not sure about their politics, right? That re-emphasizes this notion that actually there's something there still, whatever it is, right?
Yes, yeah. I absolutely agree with you. And this leads to the last question. So lastly, despite the debates about the rise and the death of nationalism and Arab nationalism, and we know that, you know, it won't go away. Like Arab will still Arab in the map, at least. But how do you think that Arab identity will transfer, let's say, in the post-conflict Syria? Like, would it be still an umbrella identity under which Sunni, Shi'i, Alawi, maybe not the Kurd, would follow, or now it's Syrianism?
Yeah, it's next to impossible to tell, honestly. I mean, one thing that I have learned about myself in the intervening years since writing this, and I sometimes feel a bit, uncomfortable about what I've written myself, you know, all those years ago, because you know, I'm very conscious that I chose to write about something because I found it interesting, and you know, it was something that I witnessed living in Syria, but far more, you know, I was aware of this when I was writing it, but even more so, I'm very aware. You know, I'm writing about a part of the world I'm not from. I do not have this lived experience of being Arab or anything like that, and I've always presented myself as an outside observer. But at the same time, you have to be very careful as that outside observer to not kind of claim this deep knowledge, or you know, or you know, the ability to sort of say, oh, you know. So I try not to say, you know, this is what being Arab means or anything like that. You know, I just try to report on what people have told me it means. And so that makes it very difficult to answer that question, to say, oh, what's the direction it's going to go in? Like, you know, I can foresee a way in which identity will be used and manipulated by authority figures, whether it's governments or, you know, local leaders, or, you talk about the Kurdish leaders and so on. And I can see that, you know, Syria is no different. Again, this is the other thing that I think perhaps in my own writing I haven't made clear enough before. Syria is no different from any other country in the world in that multiple layers of identities exist. The only difference is that, you know, its leaders, you know, at both bottom up and top down level, have made more of those identities more publicly for a longer period of time. We're seeing in Western countries how identity politics has become more and more utilized in recent years by political elites. So in many ways, you know, the Syrians were just ahead of the game. Like, you know, it's actually something that, you know, Western leaders have no, you know, superiority, much as they'd like to think of themselves, of, you know, in the use and manipulation of identity politics. So, you know, yes, it is perfectly possible that as a political society, future leaders and future, you know, activists will utilize Arab identity in some capacity for political gain, because they've used other identities, including Arab identity, in the past, and it still exists. So as long as it still exists, as long as, you know, there is someone who will, as long as there is someone who will say, should we support Tunisia or not, there is some notion of being an Arab in Syria that can be manipulated and used, you know, by different people. But at the same time, you know, there's national identity, there's religious identity, there's city identity, there's gender identity, there's you know, tribal identity, there's family identities, all these other identities that other people could utilize as well. And, you know, what happens in these situations, again, and it's politics everywhere, it's not just the Middle East, it's as much in the West or as elsewhere, when a politician tries to mobilize people utilizing an identity, it Whether it's effective or not is normally based on whether or not a rival identity that their opponents are trying to mobilize them with is considered more genuine, more effective. And that might be, it doesn't have to be the same type. So someone could be saying, look, we all need to mobilize along class lines. And someone could turn around and say, well, I disagree, we need to mobilize around national lines. And people will say, yeah, I feel a much stronger sense of national identity than class identity, so I'm going to ignore the communists and support the nationalists, right? That's the nature of political identity. So I can't say in the short answer, a long way of saying how it will look. I think it takes generations to filter out an identity to the point that people no longer feel it. What's very interesting, if we go back all the way back to nationalism theory, someone I don't necessarily agree with that much, but has got some good things to say, is Anthony Smith. And Anthony Smith says is that identities come and go, but it takes a long time for them to change. And when they do change, it's over like massive vicissitudes, massive changes, right? That they're the only circumstances in which identities can change quickly. Normally it takes a very long time. Whereas the modernists would say, you can change it in a generation. Fred Halliday would be like, you can get a new leader in, spend 20 years telling me all that you're all, members of, this religious group or this national group, then eventually people will believe it. Whereas the Anthony Smiths would say, no, the only way you can do that is with a massive vicissitude, a massive change. Syria has undergone a massive change. So actually, it is perfectly plausible that that massive change could seriously disrupt people's sense of what their identities are. Okay, but also could not. So.
Yes, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for your time. I'm not sure if Ray, do you have any comment, question, Ray?
Just to say thank you to both of you for this fascinating discussion. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I mean, I've really enjoyed that, and Ola, it's great. I mean, I'd love to hear more. Sorry, I feel I was talking a bit too much. I'd like to hear more about your research and where you're going with it at the moment.